185,000 soldiers mysteriously died overnight. Biblical prophecy and modern parallels. 185,000 soldiers lay dead. No sign of battle, no disease, no natural disaster. Just an eerie silence stretching across the Assyrian camp. Imagine standing on the walls of Jerusalem as dawn breaks, peering into the enemy's camp. The day before, it had been alive with the sounds of war, soldiers sharpening their blades, commanders shouting orders, fires crackling in the night. But now, nothing. The lifeless bodies of one of the most feared armies in history litter the ground. What could have caused this? The Assyrians were not just any army. They were the masters of siege warfare, an unstoppable force that had crushed nations, toppled empires, and left cities in ruin. With towering siege engines and battering rams built to break through the strongest walls, no fortress had ever stood against them for long. Their strategy was simple: surround, starve, and strike fear so deep into their enemies' hearts that many surrendered without a fight. But outside the gates of Jerusalem, they met an adversary unlike any they had faced before. Not in battle, not through cunning military tactics, but in the stillness of the night. What power could bring the mightiest army to its knees without a single arrow fired, without the clash of swords, without even a whisper of resistance? The answer lies in an event so shocking, so unexplainable, that it would be remembered for centuries to come. And the most terrifying part? It happened in complete silence. Tonight, we take you back to a time when Jerusalem was on the brink of destruction, a city led by a young king facing impossible odds, a people who had turned away from God, now forced to choose between fear and faith, and an enemy so powerful, so ruthless, that no one had ever stood against them and survived until now. Because in the darkness, something or someone intervened. Before we uncover this incredible biblical event, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Bible Pathways. Your support helps us bring these powerful stories of faith, history, and miracles to more people. Now let's step into the past and witness a night that changed history forever. Jerusalem's spiritual decline. The city of Jerusalem, once a place of worship, devotion, and the presence of God, had fallen into darkness. The streets that once echoed with prayers and songs now carried the scent of burning incense offered to false gods. Statues of foreign deities lined the roads, their lifeless stone faces staring blankly as people bowed before them, seeking blessings that would never come. The great Temple of Solomon, the sacred heart of Israel's faith, stood in silence. The doors once open to the faithful were now locked and forgotten. The air inside was thick with dust, the golden lampstands unlit, the altar cold. The songs of worship that once filled its halls had been replaced with emptiness. Watching it all unfold from the window of the palace was a young prince, Hezekiah. Unlike the rest of his people, he had not forgotten. While the nation drifted away, Hezekiah held on to the stories passed down through generations. He remembered how David, the shepherd king, had trusted in God and defeated the mighty Goliath. He recalled how Moses led his people out of slavery through the parted waters of the Red Sea. And he thought of Abraham, who believed in God's promises, even when they seemed impossible. To Hezekiah, these weren't just old tales, they were proof that when people trusted in God, they found strength, and when they turned away, they lost everything. But Hezekiah was just a boy. He had no power to change what was happening. The man who did, his father, King Ahaz, was leading Judah further from the truth. Ahaz had abandoned the God of Israel, choosing instead to follow the gods of the surrounding nations. He built pagan altars on every street corner, encouraging the people to worship idols made of wood and stone. He even went so far as to sacrifice his own son in a pagan ritual, an unthinkable act in the eyes of the true God. Jerusalem had become a city lost in deception. The people no longer remembered their covenant with God. They had traded faith for fear, truth for superstition. They were like sheep without a shepherd, wandering further into darkness with each passing day. But everything was about to change. The old king's reign was coming to an end, and when Ahaz drew his last breath, Hezekiah knew his time had come. He was young, but he was ready to lead. ready to stand against the corruption that had consumed his people. His first order as king was not one of war or conquest. It was something far greater. He turned his eyes toward the temple, the very place where his ancestors had worshipped the true God, and gave a command that would shock the nation. Open the gates. And with those 3 words, Hezekiah began a revolution of faith that would shake Jerusalem to its core. Hezekiah's reforms, the moment had come. Hezekiah, now king, stood before the massive, dust-covered gates of the Temple of Solomon. Once the heart of Jerusalem's faith, the temple had been abandoned for years, its doors locked, its altars cold, its sacred halls silent. But that silence was about to be broken. With a firm voice, Hezekiah gave the command, "Open the gates." The people of Jerusalem watched in awe as the temple doors, sealed for so long, creaked open. Sunlight poured into the forgotten space, illuminating years of neglect. Inside, idols to false gods stood where offerings to the Lord once burned. Dust covered the golden lampstands, and cobwebs stretched across the sacred altar. Hezekiah turned. To the priests, his voice unwavering, "Clean this temple, remove every idol, every impurity. We will worship the Lord the right way again." The work began immediately. Hammers rang through the city as workers shattered the stone idols that had polluted their faith. Pieces of false gods crumbled to the ground, symbols of deception reduced to dust. The altars of foreign deities were torn down, their ashes scattered in the wind. But Hezekiah knew that cleansing the temple was not enough. His people needed more than broken statues. They needed restored hearts. He traveled through the streets, speaking to the crowds. He reminded them of their heritage, of the covenant God had made with their ancestors. He spoke of Abraham's faith, of Moses leading their people to freedom, of David's trust in God against impossible odds. Little by little, the people began to remember who they were. Soon, the temple came alive once more. The golden lampstands burned brightly, their flames reflecting off the polished walls. Priests stood at the altar offering sacrifices with reverence. Songs of worship echoed through the halls, filling the air with joy. For the first time in years, Jerusalem felt like home again, but not everyone rejoiced. Beyond the city's walls, a storm was gathering. The most feared army in the world was watching. And soon they would come for Hezekiah. Would his faith stand against the might of the Assyrians, or would his reforms be crushed beneath the weight of war? The true test was only beginning. The threat from Assyria. Not everyone rejoiced at Hezekiah's reforms. Far to the north, a storm was gathering, one more terrifying than any natural disaster. The Assyrian Empire, the most ruthless military force the world had ever known, had set its sights on Jerusalem. The Assyrians were not ordinary conquerors. They were a war machine built to dominate, destroy, and humiliate their enemies. Their warriors marched in perfect formation, their shields locked together like a moving wall of iron. Their siege engines, massive wooden towers taller than the city walls, rolled forward like mobile fortresses, and their most feared weapon, the battering ram, pounded against stone gates with relentless force, never stopping until the walls crumbled. But their power wasn't just in their weapons, it was in their reputation. Before the first arrow was fired, before the first sword was drawn, the Assyrians had already won half the battle. Their psychological warfare was unmatched. They spread terror ahead of their arrival, sending messengers to conquered cities with stories of their brutal victories. Entire nations surrendered without a fight, choosing slavery over certain death. And now Jerusalem was next. Word reached Hezekiah that the Assyrians had crushed the northern kingdom of Israel. They had burned cities to the ground, slaughtered thousands, and taken the survivors as captives. No kingdom had ever withstood their might. And now they were marching toward Judah. The people of Jerusalem trembled. How could they, a small kingdom, stand against the most feared army in history? But what the Assyrians didn't know was that they were about to face something they had never encountered before. A power far greater than any army, a force unseen, yet unstoppable. The battle for Jerusalem was about to begin. A modern parallel. The six-day war history has seen moments where the odds were impossible, where a small outnumbered force faced total destruction, yet survived. Take the Six-Day War of 1967. Israel, surrounded by powerful enemies on all sides, was outnumbered and outgunned. Their destruction seemed inevitable. But then, something happened. Unexpected weather conditions, strategic intelligence, and a series of events that historians still struggle to explain turned the tide of battle. In just 6 days, Israel achieved a decisive victory against all odds, a moment that many believe was nothing short of miraculous. Like Hezekiah's Jerusalem, they were outmatched. But as history has shown time and time again, when the odds seem impossible, miracles can happen. And for Hezekiah, the greatest test of his faith was still ahead. Would he trust in his military defenses, or would he place his trust in something greater? The answer would determine the fate of Jerusalem. Hezekiah's preparation Jerusalem had never faced a threat like this. The Assyrians were closing in, bringing with them a reputation for destruction. They didn't just conquer cities, they crushed them. Their battering rams pounded against gates until they splintered like kindling. Their archers darkened the sky with arrows so numerous that they blotted out the sun. And their war machines, massive wooden towers, taller than the walls they besieged, delivered death from above. But even more terrifying than their weapons was their strategy. The Assyrians knew how to break a city's spirit before ever lifting a sword. They surrounded their enemies, cutting off food, water, and hope. No supplies in, no messages out. Entire cities surrendered without a fight, too terrified to resist. And now, the people of Jerusalem could hear the whispers of fear spreading through their streets. Hezekiah knew he had to act. A plan for survival first, he turned to the city's defenses. "We need stronger walls," he commanded. "Bigger, taller, thicker." Day and night, the sound of chisels and hammers echoed through Jerusalem as workers reinforced the stone barriers. The city's walls grew stronger with each passing day, transforming Jerusalem into a fortress. But walls alone wouldn't save them. If the Assyrians surrounded them, they would need something even more important than stone and mortar: water. The city's main water source, the Gihon Spring, lay outside the walls, vulnerable to enemy control. If the Assyrians cut it off, Jerusalem would be trapped without a drop to drink. So Hezekiah devised an ingenious solution. He ordered his men to dig a tunnel, a hidden aqueduct stretching over 1,700 feet through solid rock. It would redirect the water from the spring into a reservoir inside the city. The workers dug from both ends, meeting in the middle, a remarkable engineering feat for the time. The tunnel remains one of the most famous water systems of the ancient world, a testament to Hezekiah's leadership and foresight. But even with strong walls and a secure water supply, one problem remained: food. Without outside trade, Jerusalem would quickly starve under siege, so Hezekiah ordered the stockpiling of grain, oil, and other essentials. Special clay seals, known as LMLK seals, were stamped onto storage jars, marking them as royal provisions set aside for survival. Still, Hezekiah knew that physical preparation was only part of the battle. Strengthening the spirit of the people, the Kas. Assyrians didn't just fight with swords, they fought with fear, and fear was already creeping into the hearts of his people. Whispers filled the streets. The Assyrians destroyed Israel. They crushed Samaria. They've never lost a battle. What hope do we have? But Hezekiah stood firm. He gathered the people and spoke words they desperately needed to hear. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged because of the king of Assyria and the vast army with him. For there is a greater power with us than with him. With him is only an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God, to help us and to fight our battles. His words echoed through the city, bringing strength to the weary. He reminded them of the times God had delivered their ancestors, how David had defeated Goliath, how Moses had led their people to freedom. Faith was their greatest weapon. Modern parallels. Preparing for siege in today's world history repeats itself. Nations throughout time have faced overwhelming odds and found ways to prepare. Take modern military defenses, for example. Countries build underground bunkers, secure water supplies, and stockpile resources for times of crisis. Armies strategize, not only with weapons but also with psychological warfare. using intimidation, misinformation, and propaganda to weaken their enemies before ever firing a shot. During the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel faced an impossible challenge, outnumbered by surrounding nations. But through strategic planning, unexpected weather conditions, and sheer resilience, they turned what should have been their downfall into a stunning victory. Just like Hezekiah's Jerusalem, they were outmatched. But preparation, faith, and determination made all the difference. The final test approaches. Jerusalem was ready, or as ready as it could be. The walls were reinforced. The water supply was secure. The storerooms were filled. But the real question wasn't whether their defenses could withstand the Assyrians. It was whether their faith could, because soon the enemy would arrive. And when they did, no earthly power could save them. The Assyrian taunts and psychological warfare, the ground trembled beneath the feet of Jerusalem's people. From the city walls, they could see it, the vast Assyrian army stretching beyond the horizon, a sea of shields, spears, and chariots. The mightiest war machine on earth had arrived, and Jerusalem was its next target. But something strange happened. The Assyrians did not immediately attack. Instead, a single figure stepped forward from the enemy camp. He carried no sword, no shield, only words sharper than any weapon. This was Rabshakeh, the Assyrian commander, and he had come to break Jerusalem's spirit before a single arrow was fired. He stepped close enough for his voice to carry over the walls, then spoke, not in the language of kings and diplomats, but in Hebrew, the language of the common people. His voice rang out like thunder. "Listen to me, people of Jerusalem. Do you really think your king Hezekiah can save you? Do you think your God will help? Look at all the nations we have crushed. Their gods did nothing for them. Do you really believe your God is any different?" His words hit like a battering ram against the city's faith. Some on the walls turned pale. Others clenched their fists. They had heard the stories. The Assyrians had conquered city after city. No god had ever stopped them before. Rabshakeh saw the fear growing and pressed harder. "Surrender now, and we will take care of you. You will have food, you will have wine, you will have peace. But if you resist, you will starve inside these walls. You will watch your families waste away. No one is coming to save you." His voice slithered through the streets like a serpent. The people of Jerusalem began to doubt. The power of fear. Rabshakeh understood something crucial. You don't need swords to win a battle, you just need fear. Throughout history, armies have used psychological warfare to defeat their enemies before the battle even begins. During World War II, the Nazis bombarded London with propaganda, hoping to break the British spirit. In modern conflicts, misinformation spreads through social media, sowing doubt and division among people before a single shot is fired. The Assyrians were masters of this. They knew that an enemy filled with terror was as good as an enemy already defeated, and it was working. Inside the city, murmurs spread. What if Rabshakeh is right? What if God won't help us? Maybe surrendering is the only way. Faith wavered. Hope cracked. The enemy hadn't even touched the walls, but Jerusalem was already on the brink of collapse. Hezekiah's response, but one man would not be shaken. King Hezekiah stood firm. He did not run to the walls to argue with Rabshakeh. He did not let fear control his actions. Instead, he turned to the only source of power greater than any army. Hezekiah tore his royal robes, a sign of humility and desperation, and went straight to the temple. There he knelt before the altar and prayed, "O Lord, the God of Israel, enthroned above all, you alone are God. Hear the words Sennacherib has spoken against you. Deliver us, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are God." But he did not stop there. Hezekiah sent messengers to the prophet Isaiah, God's voice to his people. He needed to know, what did God say? The city held its breath. Would God remain silent? Would he let Jerusalem fall like the others? Then the answer came. Isaiah's words rang out like a trumpet. "Do not be afraid of what you have heard. The Assyrians will not enter this city. Not one arrow will be fired here. They will turn back. I will defend this city for my name's sake." Faith versus fear. Fear had spread through the streets like a disease, but Hezekiah refused to let it win. He reminded the people of who they were, the chosen people of God. He retold the stories of David standing against Goliath, of Moses parting, the Red Sea, of miracles past and miracles yet to come. Slowly, hope returned. They did not know how, they did not know when, but they believed. The final standoff, outside the walls, Rabshakeh and the Assyrian army waited. They expected Jerusalem to crumble from within, to break before the first strike. But something had changed. The people did not surrender. The gates did not open. The city did not fall. And soon something beyond human understanding would happen, something that no army, no warrior, no king could have predicted, because when God fights for you, the battle is already won. The turning point. Hezekiah's prayer, the Kas. Weight of fear hung over Jerusalem like a thick, suffocating fog. The whispers of doubt had grown into full-fledged despair. The Assyrians were invincible. Their victories stretched across the land like a trail of devastation. No city had withstood their might. No army had turned them back. And now they stood outside the gates of Jerusalem. Hezekiah, hearing Rabshakeh's taunts, felt a deep sorrow grip his heart. The words had not only attacked him as king, but they had mocked his God. But instead of giving in to despair, he did something remarkable. He tore his royal robes, a sign of humility before God, and wrapped himself in sackcloth, the garments of mourning. He refused to rely on military strategy alone. He refused to bargain with the enemy. Instead, he went to the temple and knelt before the Lord. A king's prayer for deliverance, with his face to the ground, Hezekiah poured out his heart in prayer. O Lord, God of Israel, enthroned above all, you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. Look and see. Hear the words of Sennacherib, who mocks you. Deliver us from his hand, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are God. There was no begging, no panic, just faith, a bold request that God would show his power, not just for Jerusalem's sake, but for his own name. And then, silence. But God had heard. The prophet's answer, the whole city waited. The tension in the air was unbearable. Then, the message came. Isaiah, the prophet of the Lord, sent word to Hezekiah. His voice rang through the streets with a declaration so powerful, it silenced the whispers of fear. Do not be afraid of what you have heard. The Assyrians will not enter this city. Not one arrow will be fired here. Not one soldier will set foot inside. They will turn back. I will defend this city, for my name's sake. The people could hardly believe it. How could this be? The Assyrians had never lost a battle. And yet God himself had spoken. But how would he do it? That night, the city held its breath, the night of silence. Outside the walls, thousands of Assyrian soldiers gathered around their fires, their weapons glinting in the moonlight. From the heights of Jerusalem's walls, it looked as if the stars had fallen to earth, a sea of flames stretching beyond sight. But something strange was happening. A stillness settled over the camp. The usual sounds of a massive army, marching, clanking weapons, murmured orders, grew quiet, a silence so deep it was almost unnatural. Inside the city, no one slept, and when dawn broke, the impossible had happened. The mighty Assyrian army, the greatest war machine on earth, was no more. A modern parallel. The Six-Day War history has seen moments where overwhelming odds were miraculously overturned. During the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel faced an impossible threat, massively outnumbered by neighboring countries, that sought to wipe them off the map. Military analysts predicted defeat. The world expected destruction. But then something happened. Unexpected weather patterns, strategic intelligence, and a series of unexplainable events aligned perfectly in Israel's favor. In just 6 days, the outnumbered forces secured a decisive victory that stunned the world. Even today, historians struggle to explain how it unfolded the way it did. Like Hezekiah's Jerusalem, Israel was outmatched. But through faith, preparation, and divine intervention, what should have been their downfall became their deliverance. The unfolding miracle back in Jerusalem, the people rushed to the city walls at sunrise. What they saw made them gasp. The Assyrian camp was silent. Tens of thousands of warriors lay dead, without a single sword being drawn, no sign of battle, no wounds, no war, but the mightiest army in the world had fallen overnight. And soon, the story of what happened that night would spread. Through the nations, a night no historian could ever explain, a night that would be remembered forever. The mysterious destruction of the Assyrian army dawn broke over Jerusalem, casting golden light over the city's walls. The people, weary from a night of anxious waiting, hesitated before peering over the edge. The Assyrian army had been silent, too. Silent. The day before, their camp had been filled with the sounds of war. Marching soldiers, clanking weapons, roaring fires. Their vast numbers had swallowed the land, an unshakable force ready to strike. But now, nothing. What they saw made their hearts stop. The Assyrians were gone, not in retreat, not in battle formation. They were dead. 85,000 soldiers, lifeless, tense, stood untouched. Weapons lay scattered. Horses wandered aimlessly, their riders unmoving. The entire army, one of the most powerful forces in history, had fallen without a single arrow being fired. And yet, there were no wounds, no sign of a battle. No clash of swords, no war cries, just silence, an eerie, unnatural silence. The people of Jerusalem whispered in awe. The angel of the Lord, he came in the night. A divine intervention? Some say it was a plague, a sudden sickness that wiped out the soldiers in their sleep. Others believe it was the same angel who had struck down the firstborn of Egypt in the days of Moses. One thing was certain, this was not an ordinary event. Throughout the Bible, angels had been sent as messengers, warriors, and protectors of God's people. In 2 Kings 19:35, the scripture declares that the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. The same divine power that parted the Red Sea, that toppled the walls of Jericho, that sent fire from heaven for Elijah, had moved once again. Jerusalem had been saved. The fall of a king, those Assyrians who survived did not stay to fight. They ran. King Sennacherib, who had once called himself the great king, the king of the world, fled back to his palace in Nineveh, humiliated and defeated, not by an army, not by a king, but by something he could not understand. But even in his own city, he was not safe. While he was worshipping in the temple of his false god, his own sons assassinated him, striking him down in the very place he had once mocked the true God, the mighty ruler who had terrorized nations. Met his end in silence, a lesson for the ages. The people of Jerusalem rejoiced, not because of their own strength, but because they had placed their trust in God. The Assyrians had relied on their weapons, their power, their numbers. Hezekiah had relied on faith. And when the time came, God showed that no force on earth can stand against him. This was more than a victory. It was a message that no army is greater than God, that fear crumbles before faith, that when everything seems lost, deliverance can come in an instant. And as the people of Jerusalem lifted their voices in praise, they knew this was a miracle that would never be forgotten. Jerusalem was saved. The people who had spent nights trembling in fear now danced in the streets. Songs of praise echoed through the city as families embraced, their voices lifted in thanksgiving. What had seemed impossible had become reality, not through the strength of armies, not through walls of stone, but through faith. Hezekiah had trusted in God when all seemed lost. He had chosen faith over fear, and in return, God had done the impossible. This story spread far and wide, leaving one undeniable truth: no army, no matter how powerful, can stand against God's will. It was a moment that proved what history has shown time and time again. Faith can overcome the greatest odds. What happened that night? Was it disease, a sudden plague, or was it something far greater? Many believed that an angel, a mighty messenger of God, had come in the night, the same kind of divine being that had struck down the firstborn of Egypt, that had stood with Daniel in the lion's den, that had been seen by prophets throughout history. But what if this wasn't just any angel? What if there were more? Think about it. If one angel could single-handedly wipe out the most feared army on earth, what could 7 do? That's right. The Bible speaks of 7 archangels, each with a divine mission. Some heal, some bring messages from heaven, and some fight battles no human could ever win. Which one of them might have been the angel who saved Jerusalem? And more importantly, what role will these archangels play at the end of time? But before you go, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Bible Pathways for more incredible stories of faith, miracles, and divine power. Your support helps spread these powerful messages, so make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next.